I'm really delighted to see such a large and enthusiastic group of attendees at this long awaited event. I'd like to extend a particular welcome to the friars of the Augustinian community. We honor you through this program. I also want to thank and welcome faculty, staff, students from across the university, colleagues and fellow theologians from St. Charles Seminary, from Cabrini and Eastern universities, Temple University, and others. If I fail to mention you, I apologize, but we are privileged to be in a region so rich in intellectual and theological scholarship. Members of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean's Advisory Council, a few of them have come here as well to celebrate with us, a number of alumni, and last but not least, I would like to thank the Villanova Strings for providing us with such beautiful music while everybody was entering. So thanks very much to the Villanova Strings. Although the PhD program is brand new, it rests on a strong and broad foundation built here at Villanova over many years, even decades. First of all, our theology department has offered a widely recognized and respected master's program for many decades, whose graduates teach, preach, and counsel across the country. I would particularly like to thank all the faculty, current and past, and I'm glad that we have some distinguished retired members of the department as well, who contributed to this very strong tradition of advanced research and teaching in theology and religious studies. And it is that foundation, our master's program, that really allowed us to dare to propose a doctoral program in the first place. Second, our theology department has also acquired a prior reputation as a leader of research by hosting several distinguished academic journals edited by members of our department faculty. And I'd like to name them here because they are certainly familiar to members of the department, but maybe not widely known in the university or outside it. The journal American Catholic Studies, which is the journal of the American Catholic Historical Society, has been at Villanova for many decades. Its past editor, Roger Van Allen, is here today, and its current editor, Professor Brett Granger, is a member of the department. The journal Horizons, which is the journal of the College Theology Society, has also been hosted by Villanova since the 1970s, long edited by Professor Tony Gaziba of the Theology Department, and now served well by its new associate editor, Dr. Jared Bayer of the department. But there's more. Augustinian Studies, edited by Professor Jonathan P. Yates. The Journal of Catholic Social Thought, which, though produced in the Office of Mission and Ministry, still is also a flagship of the theological thinking, research, and writing that go on at Villanova. And then I'd like to welcome formally our newest journal, Political Theology, whose editor, Dr. Vincent Lloyd, has just joined the faculty this year. So by my count, that's 5 truly distinguished national and international journals already being produced in the department and establishing laying a further brick in our academic reputation. Building on this foundation, we worked very hard over, and I originally wrote the past 5 years, but actually it's 10 years from the first time when Father Cale Ellis, then Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, invited the theology department to prepare a proposal for a PhD program. That was in 2006. Then the economic crisis intervened, plans were put on the shelf, but then revived by Dr. Peter Spitaler, then graduate director of the department, and my predecessor, Dean Jean-Ann Linney. And they worked extremely hard for 3 years, writing and rewriting the proposal and its all-important budget. And then, in a final push, in the summer and fall of 2014, we moved it upstairs to the awe-inspiring Administrative Budget Committee, and then the Board of Trustees, receiving final approval in December of 2014. So it's been 10 years in the making. This is a highly thoughtful, carefully planned proposal now program. In the meantime, the college is extremely pleased by the success of recruitment efforts in the past few years to add new faculty to the department, as senior faculty have retired, these faculty with national and international reputations. In addition to the people that I've named, certainly Father Ellis, Peter Spitaler, others who have been involved from the very beginning in the creation of this program, I'd like to also make a little shout out to Dean Christine Pallas, who became Dean of Graduate Studies in the summer of 2014, and with her highly able and efficient Office of Graduate Studies, really turned proposal into program, from writing the application, getting it online, working out all of the necessary academic policies. And so truly, as you can see, today is the result of the effort of not just a whole village, but a whole community. And it is, as in Augustine's words, ever ancient, but also ever new. Finally, last but far from least, I could not be more pleased with our success in recruiting our inaugural class of PhD students. I'm sure you've heard the expression, what if you throw a party and nobody comes? What if you launch a PhD program and nobody applies? In fact, we have a very robust flow of applications, and we're able to recruit a truly outstanding class of young theology scholars in preparation. You'll find their biographies in your program. Their smiling faces, you can see them here in person. They are with us this afternoon. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you the man who needs no introduction, but whose support of this program in the end proved to be absolutely deal-making and not breaking. I'm pleased to introduce to you the president of Villanova University, Father Peter Donohue, who is the 32nd president of Villanova University and is marking his 10th anniversary this fall as president. His visionary leadership has helped Villanova grow and flourish in so many ways it's impossible to name them all here, while still remaining true to our core values. And I would like to think of our new PhD program as embodying this vision of what Villanova can now be and will become, while still embodying what makes Villanova Villanova. Please welcome Father Peter.
Thank you all for being here this afternoon. And let me give special welcome to Dr. Cahill from Boston College. It is a pleasure to have you with us today. And Villanova opens its heart and its mind to you as well. So thank you for joining us. Several years ago, when the whole idea of adding PhD programs came about, we talked so much about how they needed to be programs that had kind of a special twist or a special niche for Villanova. That there are many PhD programs around the country and the world, and how could we continue to offer something that had a unique Villanova twist to it in one way or another. And that long proposal that was submitted by the Theology and Religious Studies Department captured exactly what we were looking for in terms of its creating this program and this PhD program, particularly around the thought of Augustine. Augustine is, as we all know, a great gift to not only to the university, but also to the world. And I was very pleased when I first read the proposal, and I think I saw it in like its 4th or 5th iteration, I'm not really sure, but that it really captured that notion of how do you bring Augustine's thought and culture and all of those ideas together. And I thought it melded so well, being right across the hall from the philosophy department, you know, that it was something that was able to really highlight what we do, not only with the philosophy PhD, but to add this new program in theology. So my congratulations to the Theology and Religious Studies Department. We have some wonderful new faculty members who have joined. I was saying, you all seem so young now. It's amazing, but we've grown this department in a very significant way, and it has also grown the university in a very significant way. So my congratulations to all of you as we begin this, and the 6 students that start this program, you will go down as the inaugural class. And, you know, 50 years from now, when you come back for your reunion, you can stand up here and say, we were the first. So good luck to all of you, and congratulations.
It is my distinct privilege to introduce to you Lisa Soul Cahill. She is the J. Donald Monin S.J. Professor of Theology at Boston College, where she has taught since 1976. She's a friend of Villanova, and several of her students are now teaching here. Professor Cahill's undergraduate and graduate degrees are from the University of Santa Clara and the University of Chicago Divinity School. She is the most successful researcher and author of 15 books on global justice, theological bioethics, the common good, the family, sex and gender, genetics and theology, pacifism and just war theory, religion and artificial reproduction. She has authored over 200 articles in books and journals, including Theological Studies, the Journal of Religion, the Journal of Religious Ethics, the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, Law, Medicine and Health Care, Horizons, Interpretation, Thought, Concilium, and the Journal of Law and Religion. She serves on the boards of the Journal of Religious Ethics, the Journal of Catholics of Thought, Concilium, Horizons, and the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, and she also is board member of the Public Religion Research Institute. In 2008, our distinguished guest received the John Courtney Murray Award, a professional achievement award from the Catholic Theological Society of America, of which she was president 1992-93. Her achievements were also recognized by the Society of Christian Ethics. She was president of the society from 1997 to 1998. She also is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the Catholic Common Ground Initiative, and she's a recipient of 11 honorary degrees. Her areas of research interest are method in theological ethics, New Testament and ethics, Christology and ethics, ethics of sex and gender, bioethics, ethics of war and peacemaking, social ethics, common good, and globalization and Catholic social thinking. It is an honor for me, upon this occasion, to welcome Professor Cahill to our celebration. This afternoon, she'll be addressing us on the topic, Can Christ Transform Culture? War and Peace as a Test Case. Please welcome Professor Cahill.
Thank you very much. It is a huge honor to be here. I am so thrilled to have been invited to participate in this celebration. I have so many friends here at Villanova. Some of them go way back, like the Kahns. Some of them are former students who are now teaching here at Villanova. And it is just a wonderful institution. I met your first class of graduate students, doctoral students this morning, and I can tell you they are very sharp, they are very on top of things, and they will make you proud. So I myself am proud to be here and to be able to participate. I consider this a great honor and a great opportunity. When I was, so of course I was invited, and the first thing I did was I went on your website to look at the description of the PhD program so I would understand better what I was trying to fit into. One of the things I noticed right away, of course, is that your PhD program is oriented around the thought of Augustine. And Augustine is not always interpreted positively as a friend of Catholic social teaching and social ethics. So I'm going to be getting into that. But I noticed as well that there were several goals in your program that appeared on the website that are very positive, proactive, and socially engaged, such as the cultural contextualization of faith and theology, a dialogue among cultures, interdisciplinarity, and the practical nature of theology, along with the prophetic mission of the body of Christ. And really, I took that last phrase, the prophetic mission of the body of Christ, as my theme for today's talk. The title of it is, Can Christ Transform Culture? War and Peace as a Test Case. This was a challenge because Augustine does not have maybe the best position on war and peace, especially as compared to Catholic social teaching. So I'm going to take a look at that and see where we can go with it. My question for today, then, is going to be, what is the prophetic mission of the body of Christ, and can it transform culture? And I'm going to look at war and peace as a lens, or look through war and peace as a lens to address that question. The title of my talk, Can Christ Transform Culture?, goes back to the title of a book from 1951 by a famous American Protestant theologian named H. Richard Niebuhr, who was actually the teacher of my teacher, James Gustafson. Niebuhr was, in some ways, an Augustinian theologian, but he set up, he had a paradigm with 5 categories. I won't go into all of them right now because it would take too long. But he had a paradigm for the way that different Christians or Christian groups or Christian churches view the relation of Christ to culture. And basically, he was asking, is Christian identity in conflict with culture so that there can't be too much of a meeting or a marriage? Or, what about Christian churches and theologies that just capitulate to culture? And all of a sudden, what Christianity is seems to be the cultural trends. Or, his favorite model, can Christ transform culture? And Niebuhr thought that Augustine was an example of Christ transforming culture, but that decision has been very much debated. And most, or at least many readers of Niebuhr's paradigm have disagreed with whether Augustine should have been placed in that favored category. So, Augustine, the reason for the question is that Augustine actually drew quite a strong distinction between true Christians and society. And he actually said that earthly peace is but the solace of our misery rather than the enjoyment of true felicity from any type of a true Christian perspective. So what I want to address today is the kind of finality or the meaning of that judgment. Was that true? And can Augustine help us in any other way? So the question then is, can Christianity transform culture away from violence and toward peace? If so, how can it? And finally, can Augustine help, or must we turn elsewhere? Taking war and peace as a test case, we see readily that there is a lot of reason to be pessimistic about the Christian transformation of cultures and societies. For 20 years after the Cold War, deadly conflict was actually in decline. Fewer wars were killing fewer people the world over. 5 years or so ago, though, that positive trend went into reverse. And each year has seen more conflict, more victims, and more people displaced. although the most common type of conflict now is not between nation states, but it is societal violence or civil violence within societies and across borders. So, as a result of that, there are more people displaced and suffering violence, and it is war, not peace, that has momentum. So while wars between nation states have been in decline, organized conflict within a nation or across borders has increased. And of course, the majority of victims are civilians. Perhaps the most intractable contemporary example is the conflict in Syria, but that is not the only conflict. To make things worse, 50% or so of conflicts that are settled by peace accords break down again into violence. But what I want to argue is that work for peace is still not useless or unnecessary or totally unsuccessful. And what we're going to be able to learn from Augustine, I think, is that while it is hard to argue that overall history is on a positive trajectory to the victory of right over might, it is not only possible to work for justice and peace, it is a necessary part of the prophetic mission of the body of Christ. Now I'd like to briefly preview for you the three segments of my argument, and then I'll go back and develop each of these a bit more in turn. And the three parts are the problem of war and peace, or just war theory. Second, Augustine and his thought. And then thirdly, peace building, which is a model for addressing conflict that I would like to raise up, and that is gaining more and more traction among religious communities in the Catholic Church and also in larger political science literature. So first of all, the problem of war and peace and just war theory. As I have already indicated, if the Church has a prophetic mission to society, and even to transform society, which I think it does, war and peace presents a big problem. The problem does not only consist in the fact that wars still exist, but also Jesus was nonviolent, and his teachings in the New Testament and his example indicate the rejection of all violence, and therefore, by implication, one would think of just war theory. Christianity, however, does have a long-standing and even dominant just war tradition. Secondly, though, despite the prophetic witness of pacifism, wars have not only always existed, but they continue unabated, although, as I said, their shape has changed. Thirdly, despite the prophetic critique not only of pacifism, but of unjust war by just war theory, every war results in social devastation and human rights abuses, so there's really no war that's thoroughly just. Fourth, Augustine, who was the original crafter of Christian just war theory and also the keystone of Villanova's new PhD program, does not appear to be of much help on this issue. So moving to the second point of discussion then, which is his thought. Augustine not only justified war, he saw culture and society as inevitably governed by sin and vice. And I will develop that more in a minute. But before I do that, I want to just highlight that I think the Augustinian heritage can be viewed more positively, as I will also develop. First, Augustine's very pessimism about social change reminds us that culture is not easy to transform. And this is a good reminder for Catholic social teaching, which tends to be upbeat, positive, engaged, but not always to have the results that we would hope it does. Second, recent study of Augustine's letters shows that Augustine himself was more proactive in working for social change than his theological writings on the city of God and the earthly city might suggest. Thirdly, these letters convey that effective work for justice has to be practical and networked, which is a good lesson for us to take with us into the peace-building category. Real change does not emanate from theory or grand ideas alone. Fourth, in Augustine's Confessions, which I understand all of your undergraduates here have to read, in the Confessions we see a brilliant display of the thesis that changing behavior requires changing hearts. Hearts are turned to the good through imaginative narratives and personal accounts, such as the Confessions itself. Through relations of trust, such as Augustine had with Ambrose, and through communities striving together for the good, such as Augustine found with his friends at Casa Chiaco. And again, those will be good notes to remember when we turn to the peace-building literature. The third category that I'm going to talk about is peace-building. Peace-building is a new model of resolving conflicts that reflects some of Augustine's positive insights. Peace builders work in local communities to transform conflicts, to develop nonviolent means of protecting civilians, and to pursue restorative justice and reconciliation. In line with the theme of the Confessions, they realize the importance of sharing stories, of identifying common goals and building relations of trust among former adversaries. To accomplish broader social goals, they form cooperative connections among grassroots activists, mid-level agents, and elites. Peace builders often work in the midst of ongoing conflicts that are exceedingly difficult to end. Yet they are still hopeful and committed to finding alternatives to armed force that are constructive, bridge-building, and politically effective. I don't have time to develop this, but I have been involved in something called the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, which has a great website with a lot of resources. It is sponsored by the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame and also by Catholic Relief Services. So under its auspices, I traveled to conferences in Burundi and Colombia to look at some of their projects and meet with some of their networks. Okay, so let's then develop these points at somewhat greater length. So first of all, the issue of war and peace, why is it a problem, and how is it developed within Christianity? So according to the biblical words of Christ, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. That is from Matthew 5:44-45. It's from the so-called Sermon on the Mount, and those words, as well as the advice to love your enemy, are often taken as the keynotes of Catholic pacifism. Jesus' ministry of the inbreaking kingdom or reign of God, his radical hospitality toward the righteous and sinner alike, his non-resistant death on the cross, and the witness of his first followers. From all these, it seems indisputable that peace and reconciliation are essential to the Christian way of life and definitive of Christian ethics. The only way that Christians will work toward justice seems to consist in this sort of nonviolence and reconciliation. In fact, the first Christians were pacifists. They renounced violence, they refused to participate in the military, and they sometimes accepted martyrdom as the potential cost of their faith. The pacifism of an earlier Christianity inspires us because it points to a kind of faithful Christian discipleship that witnesses to the new ordering of the reign of God. Yet just war tradition is also rooted in Christian convictions. Just war theory attempts to limit and restrain war and to subject it to strict conditions of acceptability. Just war theory, then, can be seen as the attempt of Christians to come to terms with what it means to love their neighbor, to protect the widow and the orphan, and to recognize God's providential ordering of human affairs through political authority. In the 4th century, Augustine inaugurated a Christian just war tradition in which violence and killing are seen as acceptable or even commanded under certain conditions. The first thing to understand about this shift is that Augustine's culture was different from what had gone before. This influenced his theology and his ethics of war. Christians in the early church were a new and strange minority sect that the Roman government viewed with considerable suspicion and even persecuted. In Augustine's day, the emperors Constantine and Theodosius changed the situation, accepting Christianity and eventually making it the state religion. This gave Christians a stake in the culture, social order, and government that they had previously lacked. Moreover, during Augustine's lifetime, the empire was under threat from invaders from the north, the Germanic peoples disparagingly termed barbarians. This lent urgency to the defense of the Pax Romana. Although Augustine defended Christian participation in government and military roles, he does have a large dose of tension, paradox, and outright rejection of culture in his view of Christ and the church. According to Augustine, the heavenly city of Christ and true Christians are formed by love of God, the earthly city by love of self, even to the contempt of God. Therefore, according to Augustine, historical cultures, societies, and governments will always remain essentially unjust and violent, even if, like the Roman Empire of his time, they secure the conditions of an orderly life in the earthly republic. Historically, the two cities are entangled with one another, and the heavenly city makes use of the limited and fractured conditions of peace and civic concord that the earthly city can provide. But the earthly city is fatally flawed. And what seem to be virtues in this life, according to Augustine, are rather vices than virtues, so long as there is no reference to God in the matter. Real transformation is not a realistic possibility, and cooperation is dangerous. Nevertheless, Augustine believes that armed force can be a necessary and moral measure to ensure relative peace in the earthly city. Augustine keeps his eye on peace as the main reason to go to war. As he writes to the Christian general Boniface, "Your primary aim should be peace. War should be fought only out of necessity in order to ensure that God will remove the cause and allow all to live in peace." Augustine says war must be approved by a lawful authority and guided by an intention of love. Yet he also regards punishment of offenders as an expression of a loving intention. For Augustine, love can be expressed in the form of killing, both to protect the innocent and to deter the guilty from further evildoing. This, of course, endangers any serious attempt to bring politics closer to the nonviolent and reconciling example of Jesus. The threat appears even larger when Augustine gets around the demands of the Sermon on the Mount by maintaining that they need not be taken literally. What is required, he says, is not a bodily action, that is, of nonviolence, but an inward disposition. If we intend the peace, then, it seems, inflicting death can coexist with a Christian's prophetic witness of love. Here, the prophetic mission of the body of Christ does not seem to be transforming culture. In later just war theory, an important distinction was made between just cause in going to war, jus ad bellum, and justice in the means of war used, jus in bello. This distinction is missing in Augustine, again to a disturbing degree. What, he asks, is the evil in war? Is it the death of some who will soon die in any case, that others may live in peaceful subjection? That is mere cowardly dislike, not any religious feeling. Remarks like this sound dangerously close to the end justifies the means. While a virtue of Augustine's approach is that he is determined to hold the entirety of the Christian life to the gospel norm of love, a clear downside, or even betrayal, is that love takes the very strange form of death and destruction, which Augustine seems to see as unproblematic. 160 million people died in war in the 20th century. Isn't this a real evil? In addition, we today would be much more skeptical about whether so-called legitimate authorities are likely to conduct war with a just intention, let alone a loving one, or that peaceful subjection for the conquered would actually result from the victor's hands. In describing Christian wars waged for the sake of peace and love, Augustine does not come across so much as a cultural transformationist as he does a capitulator to some of the worst manifestations of the libido dominandi, the lust for domination, in translation, and the social force Augustine most deplores. How we must keep in mind that Augustine has no full treatise on war. His remarks on war are often made in different contexts or as part of responses to particular events or controversies. The main takeaway from Augustine's ethics of war, then, is that it can be justified for the sake of peace if it is declared by a legitimate authority with a right intention, and that in all things the Christian moral life must be governed by love of God and by love of neighbor in relation to God. Now we will take a quick look at the development of just war theory after Augustine. Subsequent to Augustine, the development of just war theory in Catholicism is strongly influenced by the thought of the 13th century Dominican Thomas Aquinas, who was born in Italy and was a professor at the University of Paris. Aquinas reappropriates Augustine's three criteria for going to war. That is, the authority of the sovereign, just cause, and a right intention. He cites Augustine's view that a purpose of war is punishment, but he does not develop that thought in his own right. Instead, Aquinas focuses on defending the common weal. He is more restrained than Augustine in justifying war, titling his discussion with a question, is it always a sin to wage a war, seeming to imply that it usually is. He also briefly considers the morality of means in war, deciding that it is immoral to lie to enemies or break covenants. For Aquinas, the ethics of war is an ethics of justice, not an ethics of love. While he recognizes the Sermon on the Mount, he thinks its demands can and should be set aside, if necessary, to defend the common good. So in Aquinas, we have the reverse problem of Augustine. Love is not pulled in to justify violent actions, but it also does not govern the entirety of the Christian life. In the centuries after Aquinas, the just war tradition was developed and redefined. In the 20th century, a huge significance was placed on the immunity of non-combatants as a limit on means in war. Just war theory was given an official formulation by the Roman Catholic Church only in 1992 in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which also insists that the structural causes of war must be addressed, including economic and social inequalities. Following criteria developed after Augustine, then, today we would insist that the use of armed force be truly a last resort, that initiatives of armed force follow international law, that the destruction of war be proportionate to the good that can reasonably be expected to follow, that war be planned and conducted with an eye to the possibility of a just peace and a social reconstruction after war. In fact, there's a new category to address that called jus post bellum. And that transitional justice and post-war justice be implemented in a participatory and democratic way. In reality, of course, it is highly doubtful that any actual war, or even an instance of humanitarian invention, which was sort of enshrined under the responsibility to protect by the United Nations in 2005, would fully meet all or even any of these stringent criteria. So we ask, does the very project of justifying war distract us from taking nonviolent resolutions seriously enough? Is it true, as critics maintain, that we spend so much talent and treasure preparing for what we think might be a just war that we have almost no resources available for nonviolent prevention, protection, and community-based programs that could help heal the root causes of war? Christian leadership, especially the Catholic popes, have become increasingly skeptical about the moral validity of war, and much more insistent on the viability of nonviolent alternatives. So now we turn to the third general point for discussion, and that is peace and peace building. Although just war theory has historically been the most influential framework for Catholic teaching on the political use of force, it has always been theologically secondary to the Catholic Christian commitment to peace, at least at the theological level. Modern popes have lent personal support to efforts to mediate international conflicts nonviolently, including Pius IX, Leo XIII, Benedict XV especially, and also Pius X. In fact, just war theory has been in decline in teaching documents since the Second Vatican Council. The Council document, Gaudium et Spes, recognizes the duty of the international community to prevent crimes against humanity, yet also makes just war subordinate to fostering peace. It condemns total war, and it describes war as a horror and perversity that should eventually be outlawed. The compendium of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church elucidates the interdependence of the peace of Christ, justice, and love, defining war as the failure of peace. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis have all repeated virtually verbatim Paul VI's declaration, "No more war, war never again." While all these popes reserve a place for self-defense and or humanitarian intervention, they have been extremely reluctant to concede that any actual and specific use of force is or was in the past justified. To the contrary, they insist that violence is not an instrument of justice. So there's sort of a paradoxical situation of which we've arrived, where just war in some limited cases has not been excluded, and yet we hear the popes making what seem to be absolute statements about war as never an instrument of justice. So we're kind of left figuring out what to do with that. And I would say that what I take away from it is that our emphasis as Christians and as theologians should be, like that of the popes, really on constructive peace-building efforts. For example, in 2014, Pope Francis underscored the importance of stopping an unjust aggressor like ISIS. But he added, "I underscore the verb stop. I don't say bomb, make war, but rather stop him. The means by which he may be stopped should be evaluated, not by a single nation, but by the United Nations." According to Francis, we need to remember how many times, using this excuse of stopping an unjust aggressor, the powerful nations have dominated other people. More recently, in regard to Syria, the Pope has implored all sides to negotiate nonviolent solutions. In 2013, Pope Francis held a prayer vigil for Syria in St. Peter's Square, declaring that violence and war are never the way to peace. In a 2016 video message used as part of the Peace is Possible campaign in Syria by the International Catholic Social Service and Relief Agency Caritas Internationalis, the Pope insists everyone has to recognize that there is no military solution for Syria, but only a political solution. He calls on the international community to guarantee humanitarian aid, demand that peace negotiations be taken seriously, and promote a new government of national unity in Syria. This is the first papacy in which the Vatican has taken to uploading videos on YouTube, which it did with this one. You can Google it, Peace is Possible, Pope Francis video. They also uploaded a video about the Laudato Si, the ecology encyclical. So we have a new era in which we're using social media and popular media to reach out to hearts as well as minds. Nonviolent peace-building strategies, such as those the Pope is recommending, can be successful. They are not simply naive, utopian, or martyr-like types of witness that have no effect on real politics. Social scientists Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth argue that nonviolent resistance is twice as successful as armed revolt, producing resolutions that are less likely to devolve into human violence. Thus, whether or not one approves the rare use of violent force against overwhelming threats to human rights, all Catholics, all Christians, and all those interested in human dignity and the common good should prioritize practical peace-building initiatives. Peace-building can involve, for example, conflict-transforming practices such as direct nonviolent resistance or non-cooperation, trauma healing, diplomatic initiatives, interreligious political organization and civil society, unarmed civilian peacekeeping, public rituals of repentance, and initiatives of reconciliation across ethnic or religious divides. Changing attitudes, worldviews, and the imagination to conceive of different alternatives is very much a part of peace building and also reflects some of Augustine's own methods. The essential role of religious communities and leaders in these efforts is recognized by agencies as diverse as the United Nations and the U.S. Institute of Peace. And it is exemplified by myriad organizations and networks, a few of which are the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, the Nonviolent Peace Force, and the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University. Speaking to the intransigent case of Syria, Maria Stephan, who is a former State Department official now working for the U.S. Institute of Peace, and whom I met at a very interesting conference in Rome on nonviolence last April, argues that civil resistance works. In fact, civil resistance, she says, has already been effective somewhat in undermining ISIS control, creating local cultural conditions under which violence is less attractive to potential recruits, and strengthening patterns of noncompliance with totalitarian power. For example, some hacktivists, as she calls them, have managed to disrupt ISIS communications with a population of disaffected young Muslim men who might find ISIS's extremist ideology attractive. Potential recruits, she argues, also need to be presented with specific religious arguments against terrorism and with nonviolent alternatives for seeking change that have a rich history already in the Arab and Muslim world. An example is using social media to satirize ISIS rhetoric and behavior, a tactic with ancient roots in Syrian poetry. Outsiders can lend support by sending educational materials and medical supplies, and by supporting alternative media with help to create cybersecurity for dissidents so that they can avoid reprisals from ISIS. In 2016, the European Union gave the Nonviolent Peace Force a $2.3 million grant to implement locally tailored violence interruption programs throughout Syria. This project will bring together people to reflect on their experiences from across different religious and political groups, to reflect on their experiences, to identify lessons learned, and to build relations of trust. According to the Nonviolent Peace Force, an active civil society network across political, religious, and ethnic boundaries is essential to the future of peace in Syria. Now, let us return briefly to Augustine and peacebuilding. It is true that in his formal view of politics and in his occasional writings on just war, Augustine does not seem hopeful that Christ can transform culture. But in his hundreds of sermons, and especially his letters, we see a different, more compassionate, more politically committed, and more hopeful Augustine. In fact, Augustine scholar Robert Dodaro even sees him as the father of Christian political activism. In his letters to Christians such as Boniface, Marcellinus, Donatus, and Macedonius, who served as Roman government officials or military generals, Augustine advocated for structural change to end torture and capital punishment, to reduce the evils of slavery, especially the sale of children, to reform the penal system, and to protect the rights of refugees. At convocations of his fellow North African bishops, Augustine encouraged members of the episcopacy to collaborate in political activism against concrete injustices they faced. In his sermons, he urged all members of his congregations to act on behalf of the poor and to beware of the connection between injustice and wealth. Augustine realized that his actions could make a difference if he sought out specific opportunities, lined up committed collaborators, and addressed opportune and receptive centers of power. In conclusion, then, peacebuilding can be successful if it engages local communities and lists key social institutions such as churches, mosques, schools, and civic organizations to change hearts as well as minds. If it networks with governmental institutions and office holders, and gains political and economic strength from outside support. Among these are the Roman Catholic Church, the United Nations, and national governments regionally and globally. Augustine was a peace-building activist, insofar as he was a Catholic bishop, working with his own local church and lay congregations, insofar as he appealed affectively for the virtues of love and compassion. He enlisted the support of other bishops. He relied on the support of the International Catholic Church and appealed to local representatives of the Roman imperial government. Augustine did not explicitly apply this model to the test case of ending war and establishing peace. That is up to us. And we not only have international obligations, which we do, right here in our own communities, we suffer the scourge of violence. So this is not just something that happens in Sudan and Syria or Iraq. Racist violence has captured media in the past few years, but it is an ongoing reality in the lives of African Americans. Gender-based violence mars the lives of millions of women and girls who are beaten or raped, often by their own family members, while gay, lesbian, and transgender people are still victims of hate crimes. What can we all do to raise consciousness and change hearts and minds, to change ingrained patterns in our churches, schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods? As citizens and voters, we are responsible, too, for national policies that support military violence elsewhere. What can we do to pressure our elected officials to lend support to non-violent solutions to conflict, such as those called for by Pope Francis? Can we support international religious organizations, for example, or other NGOs in peace-building efforts worldwide? What we learned from Augustine about transforming cultures is that in the big picture, the future might seem grim and overwhelming. But if we look for concrete opportunities in our own environments, in our nation, or in global networks, we discover that the power of change is in our hands. According to Augustine, the letter writer and pastor, love must and can motivate all our actions. And if all our actions are courageous and determined, they can spark synergy with partners across society. Pope Francis has led the way to transformative, broad-based interreligious social action with his encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si. At the end of this year, he is going to give us a World Day of Peace message announced to be on the theme, Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace. Let us hope that it too leads to transformative, broad-based, interreligious social action as an expression of the prophetic mission of the body of Christ. Thank you.
Gail is free to take your questions.
Or comments.
We do not have microphones, so we need to give you a
Microphone.
Anyway, with respect to the goals of peace, how would you address or speak to the necessity of interior work that individuals and groups of individuals and societies must do? That is to say, you have to become a person of peace, to pursue peace. And to the extent individuals have violent hearts, violence in personal history that needs to be healed. Could you comment on how the role of this in the transformation of culture?
Well, so just going back to Augustine, since he's a common reference point, in the City of God, he says that the main form of social sin, or the main human inclination of individuals that manifests itself also as social sin, is the libido dominandi, which is a form of pride. It's a failure, of course, more theologically speaking, to love God as the highest good rather than other relative goods. So we seek to dominate other people. So he would say that is one of the main things that, as you say, needs to be rooted out, the inclination toward violence. And of course, in the Confessions and also in the City of God, he focuses on the need for God's grace. But in the Confessions, there's also a huge role for personal reflection, for conversations and reflections with friends, for the example and the mentorship of his teacher, the Bishop Ambrose. So I think he sees all of these things as ways in which grace is mediated to us, and for which we also take some responsibility. And I think you see that come to fruition in the sermons and letters, where he is appealing, like in his letter to the General Boniface, he's exhorting him to maintain Christian discipline, to maintain a Christian heart, even though he's waging war. So I think it's a complex kind of thing. You have to take a number of different approaches. So, you know, if the individual recognizes what they need to do, there's personal prayer and seeking, as we see in the Confessions. Augustine, the pastor and bishop, is preaching to congregations, appealing to them to recognize the need for love and compassion and conversion. And then in communities also, like all the bishops working together, or the Christian congregation as a whole, that's another direction. So I think you would see us needing to come at it from a number of directions at once. Sure.
Thank you, Lisa, for your wonderful lecture. Question about the conference that you mentioned in Rome and the document that came out of it.
Yes.
Relating to your lecture, I certainly agree with your call to devote more energy, more resources to peace building.
Yeah.
But I'm a little concerned with what I believe came out of that conference, which was a call for the church to abandon teaching just war. I recently heard your former colleague and my former mentor, David Hollenbach, say that thanks to the norms of just war theory, in the 20th century, the amount of violence and warfare was reduced significantly. It gives us a language, I think, to engage with our public officials in talking about the norms of war, particularly the Isabellian norms that you referenced. So, could you speak about that, this call to, should the church abandon teaching, should I stop teaching just war theory?
Right, so, well, I haven't because I just lectured on this, so I guess. So this conference in Rome that Jerry is referring to was last April. And I referred to that in my paper just very briefly, but it was co-sponsored by Pax Christi International, which is a pacifist organization that completely rejects any use of violence, and also by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, the head of which is Cardinal Turkson. And so everybody can envision what Pax Christi brought to it, but something that was also very important was the experience of the global South, and especially Africa. There were a lot of representatives there from different parts of the world, where, their experience of justifications for war is not academics talking about just war theory with, military leaders and government officials, but really, armed insurgents and armed groups who say, we have a just cause or we need to defend ourselves, but they're not using any type of fine-tuned just war theory. They're just claiming that justice is on their side and they have a grievance against some other side, and then it's, rampant slaughter that seems to be unending. So many parts of our world are suffering under this huge blight of violence. At the conference last week, for example, one of our students, Leo Lushombo, who's a woman from Congo, gave a paper on rape as a tool of war and her work with women to help overcome that. So that's just a very blatant example. So the conference issued a consensus statement. Not everybody at the conference agreed with every part of it. I did not think that it was prudent myself to call for the ending of just war theory because I feared that it would have the effect of stirring up a lot of debate about the merits of just war theory, which I think is what it did. So it's kind of leading down the wrong path. My own view, at least for now, is that, number one, I agree with the skepticism about how well just war theory really does limit violence, and how often, as Pope Francis said about Syria, it's just used to validate violence that in the end is not just. So that's one thing. The other thing, though, is that the popes are in a conflicted position that I kind of agree with. I'm not really prepared to say that it would never be conceivable in the face of some very grievous human rights abuse to resort to violence. But I don't think that the popes as our leadership, or possibly even we as theologians, should be putting our main energy into justifying war. Instead, we need to, if we're going to use just war theory, use it as the use it bellow theorists are now doing, to critique war, to show why it's unjust, to see the conditions that it doesn't meet, and then to turn our attention seriously the peace-building efforts, which the Catholic Church has really not done. The popes have all called for this ever since Vatican II, but in practice, it's not a priority of the worldwide Catholic Church. It's not a priority of our bishops in the United States. I mean, some exceptions, but it wouldn't be the main thing you would find if you went to their website. So I think that was the takeaway for me from this conference. I'm not so much interested in debating whether just war theory has any uses at all, can be used to restrain war, or whether there's some valid uses of violence. It's more, let's try shifting to another focus, which is constructive efforts to build peace.
Let's take as the last question.
So it's a bit more challenging kind of a question, because I read the book 19 of the City of God as a just peace theory rather than as a just war theory. And as you rightly said, the distinctions about jus in bello and so forth are post-Augustine. It's really hard to find anywhere in Augustine where he would ever talk about anything like a just war theory. But all of book 19 is about peace. And so I wonder if we couldn't find a way to rehabilitate the Augustine that his followers presented, and to recognize that he himself was more interested in peace than he was in war. What would you think of that?
Yeah, I think he's definitely more interested in peace than war. And certainly peace is the theme of the City of God. I think the problem, though, is that he draws such a contrast between heavenly peace and earthly peace that it tends to undercut what he talks about in Book 19, which is tranquility of ordered and well-ordered concord and so on, as the relative earthly peace that we can attain. And in Book 19, in the very same book that he's talking about concord and order, he also talks about the miserable necessities. He uses the word misery repeatedly in talking about political engagement. And he uses that horrible example of the unjust judge who has to torture an accused prisoner in order to find out whether he's guilty or innocent. And at the end of the day, maybe he will never find out, because the person might confess, or he might turn out to be without being guilty, or he might turn out to be innocent, but he will have been tortured anyway. And so you're kind of left with the impression that, well, you do what you have to do. After all, it's only a relative peace. You have to get your hands dirty. So that's the dangerous side of Augustine. But I do agree, as I think I try to reiterate in the paper, that in the tradition as a whole, and also in Augustine, peace is really the setting for talking about these things. And Augustine doesn't have a big treatise on just war, so it kind of tosses these things out. So in his letter to Faustus the Manichaean is where he talks about what's the real evil in war, is it killing anyone? After all, that's not such a big problem. But that's just a comment, like the treatise was not on that topic as a whole. It was on the wars of the Old Testament compared to the New Testament and so on. So, Augustine is not the resting point for Christian just war theory, even though he started it, which is why I went on to talk about Aquinas and then later developments. If I really wanted to talk about, Christian just war theory in and of itself, I wouldn't focus so much on Augustine, but Augustine is the focus here, and I think War and Peace is a very difficult test case. And Augustine is also often seen as not having a very constructive, engaged or hopeful social ethic. So I wanted to confront, the reality of that, but then also move to some other sides of Augustine that aren't as widely read because they come more from the letters and the sermons, some of which have only recently been translated, especially the letters. So I was trying to round out Augustine a little bit, but I think even reading The City of God, it's definitely true that peace is the main theme, and that the discussion of violence is subsidiary to the role of peace. And that he does see some use for the relative peace of the earthly city as well, and call Christians to engage in seeking it. That's it, I guess.